I'm now a second year member of our Social Justice Committee, which is very dear to my heart. We hosted last year a panel on addressing religious and spiritual diversity. And now this, I guess, came more so out of the board too, but we're going to be talking today about addressing not just racial, but any type of disparities in the field. And we have 4 amazing members who are joining us from the counseling profession, and they're going to talk to us about how they navigated the disparities in the field during their student years, during their internship, practicum, now as a profession. So I will introduce all the panelists, and then I will introduce LaShawn, who will take it from there. Don't mind if so I will start with Guy Beauduy. Hi Guy.
Hi, everyone.
So Guy is a 3rd-year doctoral student here at Montclair State University. He received his master's in clinical rehab counseling at Florida Atlantic University. He holds many certifications, such as the Certified Rehabilitation Counselor, National Certified Counselor. He is a licensed associate counselor in the state of New Jersey. Mr. Beauduy was selected as a doctoral level minority fellow by the National Board of Certified Counselors for this year of 2021. Congrats, Guy, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Culturally, he's a 1st-generation graduate student of a Haitian. Yeah, it's Haitian in Turkish, that's probably why. Heritage. Guy has extensive clinical experience working in various community settings that address the concerns of ex-offenders, those with mental health diagnosis, substance abuse concerns, and vocational rehabilitation. His research foci centers around LGBTQ concerns of Black men in counseling and counseling education. Up next, we have Carlos Flores. Hi, Carlos. Thank you for joining us. Carlos is a doctoral candidate pursuing a PhD at Montclair State University, where he specializes in social justice and advocacy. Carlos identifies as Latino, gay, cisgender man, and uses he, him pronouns. Carlos received an MA in counseling with a concentration in higher ed and student affairs from here at MSU, and a BA in sociology from the University of South Florida. Carlos works as a career management specialist at Rutgers University, School of Management and Labor Relations. Carlos's research focuses on intersection of Latino, AX, and LGBTQ identity. Carlos has taught undergraduate and graduate courses related to multicultural counseling, LGBTQ identity, and career development. Carlos has an extensive experience leading in-person and virtual workshops on topics such as developing and enhancing multicultural competence, understanding LGBTQ terminology, safe space training, and the development and use of the term Latinx. He's passionate about sharing knowledge with individuals and communities looking to advance their multicultural awareness, knowledge, and skills. And Carlos came to our social justice counseling class to present on advocacy. I think it was 2 weeks ago. So we're very excited to have you back here. And then up next we have Rima. Hi, Rima.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. Rima is a licensed associate counselor in the state of New Jersey and also nationally certified counselor. She earned her BA in psychology from Rutgers and master's in clinical mental health counseling at MSU. She's the first master's graduate in her immediate and extended family and identifies as Indian American. Being a first-generation bicultural and bilingual individual, she grew up seeing and hearing things from various standpoints. Her multicultural background has allowed her to keep an open, adaptable mindset. Her career began working with individuals who struggled with a cognitive or development disability. She proceeded to narrow her scope at Montclair State University's community counseling clinic, working one-on-one with those who experience challenges with anger, anxiety, multiculturalism, depression, relationship, and trauma. Spent some time working in an ER room at a hospital in Jersey City with people going through active mental health or substance use crisis. Providing individuals, couples, and group therapy is something she truly enjoys, and her passion for this field stems from wanting to understand people and for people to feel understood and heard. She finds the therapeutic process to be a wonderful journey as it promotes growth in various aspects of her life. Mental health is something that can impact an individual life in numerous ways. And coming from a culturally diverse background, her mission professionally is to create awareness for mental health in minority communities. She is presently working at a private practice where she gets to serve the population she dreamt of working, which is minority communities, specifically the Indian population. Welcome again, Rima. And last but not least, we have Professor Shanta Pamphile, my dear professor this semester, who's teaching clinical mental health counseling here at MSU. She's a licensed professional counselor in the state of New York and New Jersey. She owns and operates a private psychotherapy practice called Free of Mind here in Montclair, where she works predominantly with clients from non-dominant groups using a social justice and decolonized lens to her work. She also holds credentials as a national certified counselor, approved clinical supervisor, and a certified clinical mental health counselor. Shanta is also a doctoral candidate in the PhD counseling program at MSU, where she also serves as an adjunct professor in the master's program. She identifies as an Afro-Caribbean female, immigrant, and queer. Her pronouns are she, her, they. So first of all, I think it's really amazing that we have our own people here from MSU in different positions in their job. And I think it's also amazing just reading those bios and hearing about them once again. It's quite clear why we invited you four. And I don't know how we're gonna fit everything into this hour, but I hope we make the most of it. And to do that, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, LaShawn Adams, Shawnee, who is the president-elect of CSI here at Chi Sigma Iota Montclair. And she is also a doctoral program here in the counseling department. So Shawnee, it's yours from here.
Hi, that was wonderful, Zainab. I almost feel unworthy to sit in this room full of y'all because y'all are amazing. But I do want to start by saying thank you for all of the participants, besides our panelists who have come to join us today for this panel discussion. We really appreciate you coming to listen and really fellowship with us as we discuss disparities within the counseling community. We have a total of 5 questions, so we hope to get through them and still have some time for question and answers for anyone. So if you do, we'll take question and answers at the end for everyone else. If you have any questions, just hold on to them and we'll try to we're gonna try our best to allot some time at the end of our discussion for questions and answers. So I guess we should just get started, right? And you can send, Zainab just said, send your questions to the chat. So, that would be great too. So let's just get right to it. So the first question that I'm gonna ask our lovely panelists is, what roles did your sociocultural identities play in navigating through your respective graduate and your master's program? Can you please give us an example of a challenge you faced and how you use your strength to overcome them? And so I'm gonna start this with Shanta, if you don't mind starting.
Thank you so much, LaShawn. I think one of the, so I attended, I noticed I did not say that, but I attended Fairleigh Dickinson University in Madison, New Jersey for my master's program. And one of the challenges that I faced is that in some cases, I was the only Black female there. In many of my classes, it was just me. And also the fact that I identify heavily as an Afro-Caribbean female. And so there was no one who really sort of shared that aspect, that cultural aspect. And oftentimes I found myself being lumped with or being heavily identified as African American. In particular, some of the counseling theories and interventions that we were using, I noticed that there was no one or very little who spoke about me, yet knowing that we were a major part of the Black group and the Black population in the US as well. So that was one of the most salient things that stood out for me. And then the lack of support around that in terms of who do I go to. A lot of the faculty, they were white with the exception of one Black female. And for the most part, she did not identify heavily with me. And so it felt very alone there. I will say, for, based on my recollections, it felt very alone there and isolating, So yeah.
Rima, do you mind? Thank you, Shanta. Thank you. And Rima, do you mind following up from what Shanta said based on your experience? We can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. So I can definitely relate to Shanta in the aspect where I felt as though there was no one really speaking of my culture. So being Asian American, specifically Indian American and first generation, I chose a profession that wasn't the traditional route. Many Asians or Asian Americans often go towards the doctor, lawyer, engineer, entrepreneurial route. And furthermore, mental health is often viewed as a taboo in these communities and it's not addressed. And in many minority communities, there's not even a word for depression. So how do you even begin to explain this to a community that doesn't have the formal terms for this? So I'm blessed enough that my parents were very supportive in my career choice. They never questioned my choice or me, and they encouraged me to think towards what career path I wanted to pursue. And I like to describe my experience of getting through grad school similar to, the Congo Rapids ride at Six Flags, where you're in a river rapid and you're in a tube with about 8 to 10 people and you're bumping around. And eventually you get to the end of the river. And sometimes you go under waterfalls, and it wasn't a smooth sailing ride, but eventually I made it. And those bumps were trying to figure out the small quirks and small parts of the process that no one really taught me and I wasn't informed on. Kind of had to figure out and navigate by myself.
I see some common themes between Shanta and Rima on being alone or feeling like underrepresented. And so I'm going to go to Guy, because Guy, I know you have an interesting experience as a licensed rehabilitation counselor, and even going through that program. Can you give us some insight?
Yeah, most definitely. I would say that my experience is very similar to Shanta and Rima's in that, throughout my master's program, I felt like I was alone and that I didn't have same color, same gender at most times representation. Went to a predominantly white program in Florida, and I was one of 3 Black men in the entire program, from master's to doctoral, and among all 3 concentrations of counseling that we offered, right? And so I realized that my experience wasn't unique, because the other 2 Black males in various parts of the program also felt like, hey, they weren't paid very much attention to. We had no Black professors whatsoever. And the one Black professor that we did have was an adjunct. It was never offered a full-time position. And so I had to ask myself, hey, what is it that I can do to ensure that I work towards this not happening continuously and that it's not perpetuated? And so I just started reaching out and creating my own network. I started by, going to various conferences like ACA and the regional conferences of ACEs. And I started realizing that, hey, this isn't just a localized issue. Men that look like me, particularly Black men, are going through this issue throughout their counseling programs all throughout the country. And so I use these connections that I made to basically generate a network of Black men in counseling and counselor ed. And I can go into more detail about it later. But I realized that, my identity, I identify as a Black male, but I also identify as gay, right? But the most salient part of my identity is that I'm a Black man first. When someone sees me, they don't see gay oftentimes, unless their gaydar is really, really good. They see a Black man. And that's extremely important for me. And it's important that, based on my experience, I work towards ensuring that other young Black men who come up into, the ranks for counseling, whether it's a master's program or a doctoral program, don't necessarily have to face these same experiences in trying to, receive their doctorate degree or their master's degree.
Thank you, Guy. And that brings me to Carlos, because Carlos, was very welcoming when I first came into this program, and he offered himself as support to me. And so I'm going to lead this to Carlos because I feel like that's a great segue. So I'm going to ask Carlos this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was happy to try to create a welcoming environment for you because I know that was such an important aspect of me choosing a master's program. You know, I tell this story every time I talk about why I chose Montclair State and our master's program. I remember when I was looking at colleges and I would go to each of the campuses to look around. I remember walking through University Hall. At the time, it was the 3rd floor, and I was walking down, seeing all the faculty offices, and I saw these safe space stickers on people's doors. And that was just a sign, even before I met anyone, before I even had a conversation with people, a sign that people in this school and in this program took LGBTQ issues seriously, and that I would find people that I could connect with and that I would be able to be my authentic self with and to feel welcomed even before, again, meeting anyone in person. I think just speaks to that, the importance of displaying and showing that welcome, you know, those welcome signs and those tokens of, hey, like we're here to support you no matter who you are, right? So that was an integral part of me coming to Montclair and choosing the program. And once I was in the program, I really chose to focus a lot of my energy and work on issues that were related directly to my own identities. Anytime I had an assignment for class, I would pick LGBTQ issues in some shape or form. So I was always invested in, you know, being immersed in my identities as much as possible. I also volunteered and then interned at the LGBTQ Center on campus. So again, you know, not just taking the classes, but then looking to apply what I was learning in the classroom to my own community. And so, you know, those experiences really helped me throughout my master's program feel like not only I was in a welcoming place, but I had the freedom and the empowerment to address the issues that I came here to address to begin with. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Dr. Koyman, if he's in the crowd. I can't see you right now, but I was fortunate enough to be assigned to be a grad assistant for Dr. Koyman. And he really empowered me to take on these research questions that focus on my identities, on my communities, you know, looking at questions that haven't been explored before about LGBTQ men of color, right? And so again, just having that person, even if it was just one person that I had that connection with that told me, hey, not only is it okay to study these things and to ask these questions and to advocate for your community, but I'm going to support you in that and I'm going to empower you to do that. And that was really transformative for me. And then it ultimately led me into the doctoral program.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this insight, primarily because you all talk about being represented or finding a way to be represented within the programs that you are in, which I think is very important, especially when you're in the counseling field, to find your spaces where you feel safe or find the people that support you. And I think that brings up, it's a huge disparity within our field where there is a lack of representation from many minority groups. And for us to come together and have a discussion and create universality, like, hey, you're not the only one here, I think will really help for a lot of people. And so that'll segue into our second question, which I'm going to start with Carlos, because you ended. We talk a lot about the importance of receiving multiculturally informed supervision and how at times we have to advocate for ourselves. What was your experience like during your internship supervision process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was fortunate enough to have a supervisor who I would consider was very multiculturally informed and aware. And so I had a relationship with him where we would have one-on-one supervision meetings every week. And I wouldn't feel hesitant to bring up issues of race or culture, you know, or any sort of identity issues. And I think part of it is because, you know, he was the director of the LGBTQ Center, but also he was very intersectional in his work as a practitioner. And so that intersectional focus translated over to our supervisory relationship, which I really appreciated. He was a white man, I was a Latino man. So there were still, of course, differences, cultural differences among us. But I didn't feel like that created a barrier between us and to our communication and ultimately our ability to get the work done that we were there to get done. I was also surrounded at my internship site with a whole bunch of other interns and students who were diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse, international students, different gender and sexual identities, disability status. And we actively had conversations with each other, throughout our time at the center together. And so this was not just one person, right? It was also the culture at this particular organization or institution. So I think that's something important to consider as we move forward thinking about supervision, is that oftentimes we think of supervision as just two people or a small group, but really it's also within a larger system, right? And so even if you have a great supervisor who's aware and willing to talk about multicultural issues, if you're in a larger system or organization that's not receptive to that, it can still present challenges, right? So that was sort of my experience. Fortunately, I had, I would say, a very positive experience, but I know and I recognize that that's not common necessarily out in the field.
We'll ask Guy to go next.
Was it me that you called? Okay.
Yeah.
You kind of cut out there for a second. Yeah, similar to Carlos, my very early experiences receiving supervision, luckily, I had clinical supervisors who were extremely multiculturally informed and aware. My very first practicum, I remember I worked at a substance abuse counseling center, and my supervisor, she was amazing. She identified as a Latina woman. She actually was Cuban, and if you know anything about Cuban Americans in Miami, Florida, a lot of them, identify as white. They don't recognize their Afro-Latino or Latinx roots, and she wasn't one of those. And so she wasn't afraid to speak with her supervisees and broach topics of culture, right? And so I was lucky enough to have that type of relationship early on, so that it set a standard for me in terms of the certain types of things that should be covered in supervision. Now, even now being in LAC, I'm receiving supervision. And what I notice is that depending on the agency you're at, they may feel the need because simply because you are Black or Latinx, to throw certain clients your way and not have adequate supervision to parse out that relationship, right? And so that's something that I've kind of like been on the lookout for, and maybe you all will too. But like what Carlos said, I mean, it depends on the agency that you're at, and the makeup of the administration, so on and so forth. But for me personally, I've again been lucky to have relationships where culture has not been an issue in terms of not talking about it, sweeping it under the rug, and not understanding how salient culture and identity is and race is, not just for clients, but for the supervisory dyad.
Thank you. You both bring up some really good points that should be considered when getting a supervisor or getting supervision. And sometimes, like Guy, you brought up, you don't get to choose who your supervisors are. And, you don't get to choose sometimes who your clients are going to be. And sometimes being a part of a racial minority group, you may get the clients that are racial minorities just because you identify as one as well. So I like that you brought up that point, Guy, and that makes me go to Rima because I know she's working clinically right now. So maybe you could give us some insight, Rima.
Yes, definitely. So going back to my early experience for supervision while in practicum and internship here at the community clinic, my experience thankfully was very positive. I had a supervisor that took the time to understand how my cultural upbringing impacted the way how I sometimes perceive things or how it may be impacting my outlook or understanding of a situation. He also took the time to ask me questions about my culture and understand my background as well, which I appreciated because I recall having a religious event that lasted a week during practicum. And this brought me back to a flashback when in undergrad, I was asked by a professor to bring in a note from the priest at my temple stating that I was observing Diwali, which is like the Hindu version of Christmas and New Year's, and stating that I was present and that I could miss class. And in that moment, I had never felt so unseen, upset, and angry. And in my head, I wanted to say, would you ever ask anyone for a note from the priest at a church on Christmas Day stating that they observed Christmas? Now, I never said anything, and I attended the class. However, this time around, I was lucky and fortunate enough that I had a supervisor who understood that, who was multiculturally informed and understood that, this is someone's religious holiday. He allowed me to take off. And I also had peers that I completed supervision with who also shared their experiences and where their background and where they came from. That was helpful and supportive. So when receiving supervision, I think it's important to ensure that your supervisor is also knowledgeable and familiar about the challenges and the population you're working with, so that the feedback they give you can be implemented when you provide services. So let's say if your supervisor has a background in trauma or sexual abuse and you're working and your scope is working with children, that relationship isn't going to be as productive because their scope doesn't relate to yours. So I encourage you, when you obtain your LAC and are looking for a supervisor, to speak to the person briefly a bit before to gain an understanding of who they are and what they do, because you want to make sure you're also growing as well.
That's a really good point, Rima, because in practicum and internship, you may get the supervisor at whatever site you're working at, but that doesn't necessarily translate when you get your LAC. You may have to go shopping for a supervisor. So I like to look at it as like blind dating, right? You got to ask all these questions. Yeah, probably not blind dating, but y'all get the point. Like a little speed date. Like you got to ask these questions. You really want to know if your supervisors are culturally competent. You really want to know their backgrounds. You want to know if their beliefs or values may align with yours. And if they don't, are they able to adapt and adjust to give you what you need to work with and serve the clients that you are working with? And that brings me to Shanta, because I know you have extensive experience working clinically in New Jersey and New York. So I'm really excited to hear.
Thank you so much, LaShawn. And so I'm listening here, and one, I would speak to my master's experience. I interned at a psychiatric hospital in Summit, New Jersey. And what we know about Summit is that it's a very affluent area. And so my two supervisors were white, one white female and a white male. And for the most part, many of the interns looked like me. We were Black females primarily. And for the most part, we did not really work with people who looked like us. And if they do, oftentimes their experience in treatment was very short-lived. And so I also was taught multiculturalism by a white female. And as I'm sitting here listening to other people's experiences, outside of my multicultural class, I don't recall conversations being had outside of that about culture and how that shows up. It wasn't until I came to Montclair and I started a doctoral program where there was really much of an importance in understanding multiculturalism, how that shows up, and how do we work with clients and people who look different from us. And so that then became like the fire that was lighting underneath me in terms of, yeah, you have to start to see this very differently, but you also need to begin to see yourself very differently as well. I then worked at a mental health organization, an outpatient program in New York for about 3 years. And I was the only Black clinician there, while everyone else was white, with the exception of one Asian female. And in that case, the majority of clients were people of color. And very rare did we talk about, or did they talk about race, the importance of that, things like poverty, discrimination, and how those experiences were showing up in those clients' lives. And again, it was that fire in terms of I found myself feeling angry, frustrated, and knowing that something had to be different. Even now that as I am in private practice, it's even more important for me to be in spaces where I am networking and I am meeting regularly with people who are doing this work. I have spent some more time lately understanding and looking at the work that we do from a more decolonized approach. I've taken trainings in that, and I also meet bi-weekly and sometimes monthly with a group of clinicians, brown and Black clinicians who are beginning to do this work as well. And so we provide support to each other, we review our recordings, and we do that kind of supervision. But my early experiences, they were very limited, and it did not start until I came to Montclair State.
I'm not glad you had a bad experience, but I'm glad you were able to give us some diversity in the experiences and show us the other side that sometimes, unfortunately, we don't get what we need from our supervisors. And so sometimes we do have to continue our education. Well, no, we always have to continue our education, but also just seek more help. And that leads me into our next question, where I ask, and I'm going to start with Rima for this question. And as you began navigating the professional spaces, attending conferences, taking on leadership roles in counseling divisions like ACA, MBCC, regional divisions, or at your job, etc., what were some challenges that classes did not prepare you for?
Okay. So some of the challenges I felt that I faced when entering the real world was the lack of education I felt on how to work with Asian or Asian American clients and families. All of the books and classes often glaze over the fact that Asia consists of a whole variety of cultures. Whenever I read research on the Asian population, very rarely did I feel as though the Indian community or Arabic community was represented, or the Western or Southern Asian population was represented. And as a student dreaming to create awareness in these communities, it was frustrating to not see that to see that part be mentioned by educators, textbooks, articles, and the things that are providing me with the education to go out into the field and serve the community. And I feel as though many times people think Asia means a person is Chinese, Korean, Japanese, or Malaysian, but it also means that a person could be Indian, Sri Lankan, Pakistani, Saudi Arabian, or Irani. And I felt as though the only things I learned in school when working with Asian clients is that they don't view mental health as a concern, but as airing one's own laundry, to be mindful of how family systems function, the lack of awareness that causes higher substance abuse and suicide rates. I was taught some things about Eastern culture, but not much about South Asian and Western Asian culture. Rarely, if not, was it ever discussed or mentioned. And I think it's important to be culturally aware and informed when working with a client, and that involves asking questions to understand and letting the client know that you're unfamiliar but want to understand their culture, norms, values, and morals, because even within one large group, there's several subgroups and there's so much to learn, and no one culture is alike. Every culture is different. And so currently I am working with the South Asian population. And although I myself identify as South Asian and grew up in a South Asian home upholding the culture's tradition and religion, there's still so much that I don't know. So I joined a community for Indian therapists, and many times we discuss the difficulties that we face in serving our own community because we don't have enough knowledge or research on our own population to understand how these cultures may be working or functioning, because like I said earlier, there isn't even a term for depression. So how do you even begin to communicate is the concern. And the learning process at this moment is ever growing. And with the help of each other, we are able to navigate the challenges we experience along the way. And I think like many minority communities, the Asian community is just getting started in finding their voice and representing ourselves.
I like that, representing ourselves. That's amazing. And that's going to bring me to Carlos, because I really am interested in your response to this question.
Yeah, so I think of two main challenges that I've encountered One is usually being the only Latino male in my workplace, let alone the only Latino gay man in my workplace. So, sometimes it can feel a little bit lonely and isolating, being in a professional setting and looking around you and feeling like you're a token, and feeling like, will other people really get me and get the things that I am thinking or feeling? And when I was at MSU, I was surrounded by so many different types of people that going into the quote unquote real world was a little bit shocking to not be surrounded by that same level of diversity, in other places. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is when I think, particularly at the part of the question about conferences, I was, for example, in the master's program, as many of you, taking multicultural counseling and learning all these topics and ideas, and then going to conferences to present on these topics and encountering practitioners who have been in the field for 20, 30 years who are not aware of these topics, not even sometimes basic terminology. And that was a shock to me. That was a little bit disheartening. And it made me think about, as you all go into your workplaces, sometimes it's going to be on you to educate your fellow clinicians and your fellow practitioners who may have not taken a multicultural class, or their programs may not have focused on these issues the same way that your program is. So that's something that I've, going into my professional spaces, I'm always thinking about, how can I educate people, but also not burn myself out in the process, because that's not part of my job description. Right? We all have a job to do, and anything like this is going to be extra work on us, right? So how can we educate people, but also balance that with self-care?
Self-care. We'll get into that a little later, Carlos. But that's going to bring me to Shanta, because Shanta, I know you do a lot of work with narraces. And so I really want to dig in a little bit and probe about your experience with narraces and other leadership roles that you have acquired during your professional journey.
No problem. I think I keep going back to the part where you talk about what were some of the challenges that classes didn't prepare you for. And the thing that comes to mind is, well, we all have a cognitive understanding of this. And this is what our classes, we have that knowledge, we acquire it, we read. But what we don't get, and I'm not sure how that gap can be bridged, is this sort of the affective experience. Like when you are in there and you sit with the emotional part of this, or the emotionality behind being alone, being isolated, being one of the only, being the token, not seeing anyone who looks like you, I think that's where we're not prepared. And I'm not sure how a university can prepare you for that. I think they can. I'm just not, I have some ideas, but I'm just not sure yet. So I think even when I think about even being part of NYRACIS, I was the student, graduate student representative for about, the role was 2 years. I was in that role for 3 years. And how did I get started was, I remembered what was I? Emerging leader, and I attended that conference and whatnot, and I sat there and I looked up at the panelists and I'm like, where are the people of color? There's no one here. And on that day I said, I want to be there. I want to be there. And I came back to Montclair and I approached Dr. Glossoff, and Dr. Coinman was my mentor, and also I believe he was also my chair as well. And we had conversations about that and what that would be. But again, having to navigate it, for the most part, it was alone in terms of who do I turn to for support. Oftentimes I would come to Dr. Coinman with some questions. Other times I had to sort of sit in it alone and try to figure it out myself. But I think that's the part that's missing, that sort of emotional experience. Knowing that we are also counselors and we're preparing people to be counselors. So how can we bring that in?
Thank you, Shanta. And that's going to lead me to Guy, because Guy is a minority fellow. He works closely at NBCC now as a doctoral student, and I know he's a part of other divisions in counseling. Can you give us some insight too?
Yeah, most definitely. I think there's a lot that I could say that the classroom does not teach you, especially when you're a master's student and you're, thrown out to the wolves as an early clinician, right? And what I started learning a lot of different things, going to various conferences, being a part of a network. And it's that not every program is the same, right? And counseling may look different. Culture in a counseling program may look different depending on the region that you're in, depending on the state, depending on what part of the country you're in, right? And the demographic makeup of the program and the culture within that specific program. And that's something that I had to learn very early on. Once I branched out of my my circle, if you will, in Florida, I started realizing, hey, people are actually doing research that focuses on people of color or queer people. And there are spaces that I can put myself in where I can actually be comfortable and not worry about being the token Black guy or the token gay guy. And so having that exposure and attending conferences, being a part of networks allows me to realize that, hey, there are spaces that I could be in rather than fighting in a space where I'm not represented and I'm not necessarily wanted. But with that being said, leads me to the other thing that I kind of unearthed on my journey. And it's about advocacy. And so because I'm a certified rehabilitation counselor, a large part of our curriculum talks about advocating for our clients with disabilities. Not every counseling concentration curriculum is going to focus on that, but there isn't only an advocacy piece for clients, but an advocacy piece for yourself. So I pride myself in being a networker, right? Wherever I go, I'm always in your face, so talkative, trying to connect with people because that's my energy. But not everyone's that way. And so who advocates for counselors in training or recent graduates or those who want to do doctoral study who aren't an in your face, put myself out there type of person like me? And so I've come to learn that advocacy, it has many different shapes and forms, yes, but there are going to be a few of us who have to put in the work so that we can umbrella and catch all these other individuals who don't have it like us, who don't have the same disposition as us, so that we can be my brother's keeper, right? And so I say all that to say, your counseling program is not always going to prepare you for what's out there in the real world, right? And so it's important to make sure that you establish connections when you can with individuals, not just in your school, not just in your state, all across the country or whatever which way you can, so that all of those areas where you may fall short are replenished.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much, panelists, for your insight on that. And Carlos, you mentioned self-care. And so this goes right into our next question. Solidarity, avoiding burnout, mentorship, etc. We hear about the need to take care of ourselves all the time, right? And so can you give us an example of how you engage in self-care? Example, like you have a mentor that you check in with, supervision groups that you attend. I know some of you already briefly mentioned it when you were talking, but what do you all do for self-care?
Yeah, so I would say I do have a few mentors that I check in with to talk things through, whether it's work related or even personal, people who are slightly removed from those situations to give me an outside perspective, and also just people that I feel like I can talk to and, get things out of my own head, and out there. So I find that helps me. Another thing that helps me is taking breaks from social media, which can be challenging if you're someone who, wants to advocate for change and you want to be well informed and you want to know what's going out there and have a pulse in terms of what's going on in everyday events. I think that's important, and social media can be a useful tool for that. But I think it's also easy to get overwhelmed by the amount of information that is out there. So for me personally, I try to take breaks from the social media just so that I don't get overwhelmed and I can be a little bit more strategic in how I'm using it as a tool for social justice.
Thank you, Carlos. And I want to know what Shanta does for self-care.
So I do have a mentor that I check in with. I also talked about that clinician group, and we also spend time together reading and also doing a lot of self-practice, primarily from Resma Manican's book, My Grandmother's Hands. So we would spend time doing some of that work together. I also try to get away from the work that I'm doing, the dissertation, seeing clients, all of that stuff. I try to get away from it. One of the things that I decided to do out is to work out some more. So I do have a personal trainer, and I get at least acupuncture once a week or bi-weekly as well, just so that I can remain sane. And it has been one of my saving graces, and making sure that I'm taking my supplements. Carlos, you talked about social media. I've deactivated a lot of these things. So I'm so removed from it. And I do like that. When people ask me, well, what is your Instagram information? Catch me on WhatsApp or catch me on Pinterest. That's all I have. And my Gmail, and that's it. So for the most part, I tend to go inward a bit and just spend time with my dog. That's another relief for me. So yeah, I'm a dog mom and I like that. So that's my self-care.
Shout out to the animal lovers out there. And acupuncture, I think it's a very up and coming and very good. Check it out, everyone, if you haven't. And that brings me to Rima, because you're in the field, you're active daily. What do you do for self-care?
So for self-care, I definitely talk to my mentors and my supervisors. Being fresh in the field, the first thing I realized was that I felt a greater weight in the sense of responsibility because I no longer had the professors and supervisors watching my sessions or providing me feedback or giving me that little pat on the back when I did a good job. So flying solo, that realization scared me and I started to over prepare. So talking to my supervisors and finding a way to alleviate my concerns and feelings and finding ways to do things more efficiently and swiftly was helpful. In terms of actual self-care, I'm very mood-based, so I have multiple ways to practice self-care. So whether it be sensory through audio, motor, olfactory, or taste, whether I'm socializing or doing something physical. So music is something that I enjoy having whenever I'm doing anything. So singing and dancing is always tied in to whatever I'm doing, whether it be cooking, helps me feel good, helps me get the energy out of my system and the things I'm feeling. Sometimes lighting a candle and just drawing and or cleaning and feeling refreshed, feeling decluttered. It's very helpful. And then there's the days where I just want to sit on my couch in a blanket and watch some TV and just do something totally mindless. So that's how I practice self-care. And I think it's important to have different forms and different ways to practice because it's very easy, especially if you're working from home now, to kind of lose that sense of boundaries and lose that balance, healthy work balance and practice of self-care. So I think it's definitely important to make time if you have a hard time finding time.
Rima, you brought up such an integral point of how we are in the new world, essentially, where many counselors or therapists are working virtually, even students. Like sometimes we have classes virtually and we can't come in, and we can get that Zoom fatigue. We can get that overwhelming feeling of just always being in the house. And so I'm going to go to Guy because I know, Guy, you've been a student both virtually and in person, and you've also worked clinically, and you also were a professor. You're like a jack of all trades. So like, why don't you tell us what you do for self-care?
Oh, you're making me blush, Shawnee. So like Rima, I have a mentor that I meet with bi-weekly. My mentor, I've had this relationship with him probably since like my first or second year of my master's program. And so, we constantly check in with one another and we're able to be real, and I think that's important, allowing yourself to be in a space where you can be yourself and express yourself the way that you like Also the network that I've been telling you all about of Black men on the GroupMe app. We have a space where, anything that we're going through, we can just, blurt it out, and someone will respond, whether it's a question or just a comment, and we're just looking for feedback. So from a professional standpoint, that gives us the ability to kind of like de-stress in a way. And in terms of like bona fide self-care, I think it's important that everyone identifies what their value system is. I know for me, just like you, Rima, I love music, but not just any kind of music. I'm really into marching and concert bands. And so I'm from the South, and we have a lot of HBCUs in the South, and I'm a marching band geek. So anytime there's a classic going on, like Southern University versus Grambling or FAMU versus Bethune, listen, I'm on the next flight to the classic, okay? So, if you're trying to look for me this weekend, I will be in the Florida Classic with my kids and my nieces and nephews. So don't call thinking you're going to get me. But, identify what your value system is. I know when I'm around my family, my heart is so full and I feel so replenished after a full work week of just being exhausted by all the demands of being, a student and a therapist, and all of these different things. And so for me, I always identify what it is that makes me happy, even if it's just like a random Saturday watching some college football, or a Sunday watching some NFL. I resonate with what you said, Rima, in that, finding anything that you can do that's mindless, and you enjoy, even that can be self-care. And so all of these different things I take part in just to kind of like de-stress myself and find myself at a place where I'm grounded, so that I can be replenished and go back into doing the work that I do.
I appreciate all of your answers. Self-care is so important because how are we going to take care of other people if we're not taking care of ourselves? So, and that brings me to our last question before question and answers. And I want to start this one with Guy. If you could talk to your first semester master's student self, what advice would you give them?
So much has changed since then. I think for me, I guess a lot of times I would doubt myself. And I realize now a lot of that had to do with me being in predominantly white spaces. For a large part of my life, I've always felt like I've had to wear this mask, but I always teetered between, am I enough? Or will I ever be enough? Right. And so until I was able to see, persons that looked like me who were achieving in this field, I never really understood whether or not I would have a space or whether or not I would be successful as a counselor or as a counselor, educator, professor, be able to own my own business, whatever have you. And so I would just say to myself, continue doing what it is that you're doing, but make sure you put yourself and find yourself in spaces where you're accepted and where you're wanted, because it's in those spaces where you're going to flourish the most. That's what I would say to myself.
What about you, Carlos?
I think I would tell myself to slow down and to focus on the present moment more. I think I was always thinking about what's next, what classes am I taking next semester, where am I going to do my internship, what type of job am I going to have after I graduate? And those are all important questions to think about throughout your program. But I think, I had such a positive experience throughout my 2 years in the program, and they went by so fast and I missed them so much, that I wish I could go back and just enjoy that time a little bit more and not be so worried or anxious or stressed out about what's coming next, right? And trusting that by focusing on the next step in the process, I will get to that finish line. I've sort of been learning that all over again now in my dissertation process, thinking, tending to think about, okay, where is the finish line? When am I going to finish? Am I going to finish in May, in August, right? And I've started to slow down and think about how can I focus and enjoy the steps that I'm working on right now? Because if I do that and I focus on the next step and then the next step after that, I will get to that finish line eventually, right? But it's about the process as much as it is about the outcome.
Amazing. Shanta?
One of the things that I would have reminded myself to do is to find spaces that look like me. Guys, you were talking about the marching band, and you talked about Grambling State. I actually attended Grambling State when I came to the US. That was my first point of contact with the US when I left my island, St. Lucia. So I would have reminded myself of that, but also to know that I am enough and that I deserve to be in those spaces. So that is one of the things I will want to make myself very clear. And as Carlos talked about the idea of, burnout and when's the next thing and when's the next thing, because I think sometimes as minorities, that's an important thing for us, especially if we've been the only one to occupy those spaces in our families. Like if we're the first generation. And that has been my story ever since. And so it's always like, okay, what can I do? What's next? I need to do more. I need to do more. And lately I'm like, you know what? I've done enough already for right now. And so that enjoyment and taking time for the other things in life, because they are equally as important. And I thought that I would have been done with my doctorate by now. I had this game plan that I wanted to wrap up. And at one point I'm like, other things came up and I'm okay with that. And like Kyle said, it's going to happen. It will happen. So this idea of slowing down and really seeing the bigger picture and contact and community is important. So I would have reminded myself of that too.
Thank you so much for that, Shanta. And finally, Rima, I'm going to bring it to you because you have to close us out.
All right. So if I could give myself a piece of advice for when I first began, I tell myself that I'm in for a whole lot of learning about myself, and that I should speak up and share my thoughts or perspective. I was very, very shy, and I often would not participate out of fear of not being heard or understood. I had thoughts and opinions in class. I never had the courage to speak up because my opinion and thoughts were always different from the majority. But what I didn't realize until later on is that my thoughts and opinions didn't match theirs because I didn't grow up like the majority. I was different and I had so much to offer because I was different. And my goal from the beginning was to create awareness, and I didn't do my part early on. And so I would go back and tell my first semester self to speak up because I do have something to offer, because I was born here, but I grew up speaking Gujarati first. I actually went to ESL because I didn't go into school speaking English. I went to India every single summer. And I am very much Indian when I am in America. And when I'm in India, I'm very much American, but that's another thing. And so when I entered the workforce in the real world and was working at Christ Hospital in the ER, a lot of the professionals were primarily Caucasian. And that's where I realized that my background is very helpful. There were the population that we were serving there is primarily minority communities, oftentimes Indian. And I realized that people were looking to me for guidance on how to communicate or how to explain things to the South Asian community. And so I would tell myself that I have a lot to offer and that being different is okay. And having a difference in opinion and perspective doesn't make me right or wrong. It just is a different perspective and a different outlook.
I am so grateful. I don't know about y'all, but I feel so overwhelmed with information and knowledge from our wonderful panelists. And I want to bring it to the floor or the Zoom room and ask our other participants to ask some questions of our wonderful panelists. And you can direct it to the panelists directly or however you would like to do it. But we definitely want to hear from our audience, even if it's just a comment or a concern.
Well, I'm sorry.
No.
I just want to say thank you for being so transparent. It was very refreshing that I hear things. I'm a first student. I'm a first semester clinical mental health not clinical mental health, what are we doing? Doctor and student. This is my first semester here. And it's refreshing to hear things that I have been thinking, but I didn't know other people were, have the same thoughts and were going through the same things or have gone through the same experiences. So thank you so much. And I'm glad I came.
We have just one second. We have one comment from Fatma. I hope I'm saying your name right. I apologize if I'm not. Thank you. To hear those stories, such a relief for me as being an only Muslim student in my classes. Many universities around the US are committed to diversity and inclusion, but they often forget to include religion in that vision. And I just wanted to emphasize this too. And thank you for your time and effort for advocating for this critical issue. Thank you so much. And it is important. And I hope, Zainab, before we leave, we'll talk about our own initiative with our social justice committee and is that Zainab right there? Oh,
That's
Zainab.
me. Fatma's one of my dear friends. So we just talked about this issue on the way here, but I think she also wanted to publicly acknowledge that, whether it's race, religion, ethnicity, it seems like a lot of us are feeling alone for many different reasons in this counseling community. And I get that, we can advocate together, but I think we each have our own issue that we feel alone in. So in a sense, we find solidarity in each other and learn from our experiences to then use those power to advocate for different issues. And for Fatma and I she started a year after me. So I went through this program being the only Muslim student in those classrooms, and now she's experiencing the same. So I feel that.
It's very important. We want to emphasize that culture is not just a race issue. Culture is so many other identities facets within that, and we definitely want to emphasize, and that's why we try to get a very good panelists that could represent different identities so that we can cover some things. And we couldn't cover all, but we have to start somewhere, right? And so Dr. Hannon did give y'all a shout out. If y'all don't know Dr. Hannon, he did say congratulations. You all did very well, and I concur, along with Dr. Che. Thank you so much, Dr. Che and Dr. Hannon, for coming out and supporting us today. It's so great to, and Dr. Coyman, but we love you, Dr. Coyman. And I know we have one more hand. I don't know if I'm seeing things or not. That sounds super close. But do we have one more hand in the audience inside? Yes, I see it.
Hi, it's me, Brittany. I just wanted to echo what everybody said. I really appreciate all of your perspectives, and I think similarly, these are a lot of things that I've held internally, but not necessarily shared. So I appreciate this conversation, and then also your acknowledgement to some of the intersectionality in your identities too, because I think that's a big piece. It's a big focus to just hold one identity, but then when you hold multiple, it can amplify some of these things too. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other person want to give a comment, concern, question?
I have
One more coming in from the right. Go more.
Here,
a little more.
okay, awesome. First of all, thank you all so much again for your time. I mean, this was such an enriching discussion, and I feel like I learned a lot. I'm grateful for that. And I have one question because it kind of came up, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. Guy, you were talking about being enough, and Shanta, you kind of talked about that too. When it comes to the imposter syndrome, is it something that you went through your program? Is it something that resonates with you? And how did you deal with it?
Oh, that's a great question, Suni. I'm just gonna leave it to y'all.
Yeah, most definitely. The imposter syndrome is something that that I've carried for quite some time, even to this day, not as heavy as it was in the past, right? You know, I'm maybe a few weeks shy of becoming a doctoral candidate. And, you know, I do teach at various universities as an adjunct, but there's still a lot of room for growth in terms of my professional career trajectory, right? And so until you're actually in a space, I feel like you haven't gotten to a point where you can kind of shave off a little bit more of that imposter syndrome. But I've done a great job at getting rid of a lot of it, you know? And a lot of that just had to do with not being in spaces where I could see persons doing that who looked like me doing the type of work that I want to do, right? And I think as you build your professional identity and you develop over time, and you create these networks, and you put yourself in spaces where you're fully supported, the imposter syndrome isn't as big of a burden. Of course, anything that you go into that's arduous, that's rigorous, that's foreign to you, you're going to have times where you just don't have that level of confidence. But making sure that you surround yourself with the resources, the tools, and the support systems that you need helps that imposter syndrome subside. And so that's what's worked for me. Carlos talked a lot about how, you know, when he was looking for master's and doctoral programs, he felt so comfortable, you know, going to University Hall and seeing these safe space stickers on all of the professors' offices, even though he hadn't met them. It was the same for me. Like after leaving my master's program, I didn't want to be at a counseling program where it was predominantly white anymore, no Black professors, no Latinx professors. I wanted to be in a space where all of our mission in terms of cultural prowess was the same. And that was a large reason why I chose the Montclair State Counseling Program, and a large reason why I'm in network with all of these other counseling programs and doctoral students across the nation who have the same mission. And so all of these different things, identifying spaces and areas and people and networks who have the same mission as you, all of these go a long way in helping one rid themselves of that imposter syndrome.
Thank you, Guy. Shanta, Rima, Carlos?
One of the things that I want to add to that is that the imposter syndrome, I don't think it ever fully goes away. And I think Guy, you just sort of alluded to that, but that it does get better. What I will say is that I think the pandemic, I really had to sit with myself and the work that I do, and how was I choosing to let my career and what I do and all of these degrees define me. And one of the things I decided to do was to really step away from that and to tell myself that this isn't who I am, but that is something that I hold and something that I have and something that sometimes I like to do. And I think once I was able to do that for myself, there are spaces where it matters less to me as to what people may perceive about me, what people may think about me and my degrees and what I don't have. And so once I've decided to let go of that, it's been a lot better, to the point where sometimes I've questioned whether or not I want to continue to do this. And I know it's going to be different for everyone, but I think really sort of sitting with myself in that way during the pandemic really made this a little more life-changing and less stressful for me personally. So that's my takeaway from that.
Rima, I know you're not a current doctoral student or anything like that. And so I kind of want to know your perspective as someone who just recently graduated last year and is now working in the field, and you are a new counselor out in the field. How does that imposter syndrome resonate with you?
It's a very good question. Oftentimes, like you said, I'm very new in the field, so I'm still learning. So sometimes it makes me feel as though I might not be prepared enough, or I'm not ready enough, or I don't know enough because I'm not as educated on this topic. However, the thing that's important to remember is that education is ever growing. You're going to be continuing to learn, and that self-doubt that often does come up when experiencing challenges. You know, when you see a client leave out of nowhere, or when a client cancels, you often think, is it me? Am I not doing well enough as a therapist? And am I not doing well enough as a clinician? Am I not educated enough to be working with this population? And so oftentimes it takes a lot of checking in and discussing with supervisors and mentors to kind of confirm and validate those feelings, and knowing that I am enough. I do deserve to be here. I can serve this population, and I am well equipped because, you know, my education and everything thus far says otherwise.
Thank you, Rima. And last but not least, our Carlos, who is currently a doctoral candidate for Montclair State.
Yeah, I think something that's helped me is redefining what knowledge means. I think a lot of times we think of knowledge as textbook knowledge, right? Or number of years of experience in a field. But for me, recognizing that me as a person, through my personal experience, I can contribute something to the table, you know, that really empowers me and that goes against the imposter syndrome, because then if it's not just textbook knowledge, if it's not just how many years you worked in the field, if it's in addition to those things, what I bring as a human being through the collection of all my personal experiences, then each of us uniquely contributes something. So there's no imposter, right? Because we're all bringing something unique to the table. And I think that has really helped me push against this idea of imposter syndrome, because as soon as I get into that mindset, I think, well, wait, how many other Carlos Floreses are there in the world who had exactly the same type of experiences I've had, right? And so that puts me in a unique position to feel like, okay, I can actually do something here that makes me feel worthy.
Shirley, one quick thing, if I could go ahead, and I just wanted to add one quick thing to that.
No, go ahead, Shanta.
Yeah, as we're sitting with this, I was just thinking about like just the panelists itself and what are some of the experiences that we share in common, but to also note that imposter syndrome also shows up when we are in spaces that look where we are the majority. And so even when we started, I'm like, oh wow, I didn't say much in my bio. And look at all this other brilliant stuff that everyone shared. And I'm like, but does it really matter? So even just noticing, giving up an example of when it does start to stir up in me and in ourselves, that it's not just a thing that happens in white spaces. It also can happen in places where we are the majority as well. And I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Shanta. I think you bring up some really valid points, all of you actually. And we have one more question. It's from our faculty advisor for Chi Sigma CSI chapter, Dr. Coyman. Nice to see you.
Great to see you. I just want to say thank you to all of you first.
Yes, thank you.
It is amazing to hear your collective voices. And it really is empowering. As someone who's been in the profession for many years, it's so refreshing to hear your voices and the power you have in speaking collectively about your experiences. So thank you. Also, you know, we know that we're training, and from a training perspective, we're training people in a very white, Western European, heterosexist, male sort of idea of counseling. And so and this is a big question, but just a quick answer is easy. Given that, what do you think if we could wipe the slate clean and train people differently? What would you suggest? Something simple. If we were starting fresh, how could we do it differently? It's a big question.
It is a big question, and we're going to limit time.
Yeah, my response to that is very short and crisp. First and foremost, I would start with, you know, training students about worldview and the importance of individual differences. Those two elements right off the bat. We would deconstruct curriculum, deconstruct any and everything westernized, heterosexist, and white, and start simply from worldview and understanding the importance of difference in culture and identity, and branch off from there.
Let's do.
I saw you snap it.
Rima?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Guy said. I was kind of thinking similarly, where it's important to discuss how each person has their own story, their own upbringing. And similar to what Carlos was saying earlier, how many Carloses do you know that have the same background? You know, you even grow up in the same family with your sibling, but you guys have two totally different experiences with your family, you know? So I think it's important to mainly talk about worldview and how all the experiences and situations people go through impact them and themselves, and go from there. Because when we do think about it backwards, everything is very standardized. It's white male. It's the basic thing. So the slate does need to be wiped clean and start from worldview. I agree with Guy totally.
Carlos, Shanta.
You can go, Shanta, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. What I would do, I would eliminate white voices, and I would bring in more voices and more beings of culture. That's just where I would start. And when we talk about the idea of worldview, I would want them to be the one to be at the center of that, really sort of helping shape that worldview. Because for the majority of the time, in fact, for all of the time, the voice has really been white voice and white supremacy and all of that. And so I would eliminate their voices. Simple.
I know that some people have to leave, but before they go, I do want to say thank you. We're going to do another thank you, but for the people leaving, thank you for coming and joining us today. And Carlos, I'm sorry I cut you off.
That's okay, no worries. I would say, you know, I would build theories from a communal collective perspective, not the brainchild of one person. No dissing the people in your textbooks necessarily, but you know, I would invite all members of a community to the table to talk through what's going on in your communities. What do you see in individuals? What's your own experience? And build a theory off of that, right? With multiple voices, multiple experiences and perspectives contributing to our understanding of what human nature is, and not just what one or two leading people think it is.
That's absolutely, if we got nothing from this experience, I think listening to all of you all and just you sharing your knowledge and everything that you've all been through or navigated, survived, to be here today with us. We just want to show our gratitude, our appreciation to you, panelists, and also to our participants. We are extremely thankful that you took time out of the middle of the day of y'all schedule to come and talk about navigating disparities within counseling. And we have a few announcements. If you are a member of CSI, please join our GroupMe. We also have a Facebook group. Please add us on Facebook. We're trying to get social media savvy. So please support us. And we do have a link to our panel discussion for our social justice committee that was hosted last semester that addressed religion and spiritual diversity in counseling. So if you have time, check that out as well. But overall, if you're not a member yet and you qualify to be a member, please look out for that call for new members email that should be coming out sometime this week, because it's about that time of the year. So any closing thoughts that anyone wants to do? If not, I just sincerely want to thank you all from the bottom of our heart. I don't know where our president is, but Ms. Suni Sharma, if you could please come and say some final words. Our president of CSI, to close us out.
I mean, I just can't express how incredibly grateful we are for your insight, your wisdom. The reason for this panel was so folks who belong to more minoritized communities can see themselves represented in doctoral, like if you're a doctoral student, if you're a doctoral candidate, if you're in a master's program, if you're a working clinician, because sometimes we don't see that. And if we're not represented, if we don't feel that representation, it's hard to keep going. So we're just incredibly, incredibly grateful for all of you. Thank you so much for your incredible remarks. And yeah, I guess that's it. Any final thoughts for you folks?
Round of applause.
Let's give them all a round of applause, virtually and in person. You're amazing.
Yes. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. We will be in touch with all of you to follow up and say thank you, but thank you so much. We're so appreciative. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.